Good afternoon. My name is Ian Brzezinski, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. Let me first thank Dan for such powerful remarks and setting the stage for the rest of our day and for tomorrow. That was quite a clarion call to continue making history by the United States and Central Europe. I have the privilege of being on the spot conversation with Senator Chris Murphy. He is a senator in the United States Senate on his second 6-year term. He brings to that office a career in public service, including 8 years in the Connecticut General Assembly, 3 2-year terms in the U.S. Congress representing the 5th District of Connecticut, and in the Senate, he sits on key committees, including the powerful Appropriations Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And in the latter, he has defined himself as a strong proponent of diplomacy and international human rights. He's been a powerful advocate of American leadership, defined by strategic purpose and moral clarity. And he's been one of Congress's strongest proponents, supporters of NATO, and one that has also expected a lot of the alliance and our allies. So we're going to talk about Central Europe, and as Dan pointed out, this is a 100-year relationship we have with these countries. And I think a good baseline question to you, Senator, would be, from your vantage point on Capitol Hill, what are U.S. interests in Central Europe? Why is this still an important relationship? What are the political, economic, and military interests we have in this region and the relationship?
Well, Ian, thank you very much for having me. Dan, thank you for setting the table, and thank you to all of you for being invested in this relationship. Listen, I think Dan laid out that case very well, but if I can just add to it, it matters from our perspective, because Europe matters. The transatlantic relationship today is more important than ever as we try to figure out how we protect our own people's interests in a world that may be dominated by other kind of economic and political systems, i.e. the Chinese, in the next 50 to 100 years. If the United States and Europe don't link each other together more tightly, then we're done for. And Central Europe is, of course, a big player in making sure that those linkages remain tight too. It matters because Russia is on the march, and we see in and around Central Europe the opportunity Russia sees to try to undermine young democracies and to try to gain and grow its influence. We are all young democracies. The United States and Central Europe, they compared to us, they look younger, but democracy is not inevitable, and the health of their democracy is reflective of the health of ours, and we're seeing the same kind of attacks that Dan outlined, particularly these new isolationist nativist attacks on participatory open democracies, find purchase both in Central Europe and in the United States, and so we're better to link our causes together. And then lastly, we just have a strong legacy of Central Europeans migrating to the United States. We have parochial interests in our states and in our districts, which link us to this part of the world, and that commands the attention of many members who want to get reelected.
You mentioned the transatlantic dimension of this relationship, including the alliance, which is the institutional embodiment of our relationship, or at least our security relationship with the region. Well, as someone who worked on Capitol Hill in the 90s and tries to follow events on Capitol Hill, I've been struck at the level of congressional support, Republican and Democratic support for the alliance. I would argue it's at unprecedented highs. How enduring is this support for the alliance? Is this a manifestation or reaction to President Trump and his rhetoric? Will it be as strong if President Trump is not reelected? If President Trump is not reelected, will Republicans and Democrats continue to be as ardent in their support for the alliance?
So I think part of it is a reaction to President Trump's attacks on NATO, but it merely reflects what has long been a truly enduring bipartisan consensus around NATO. And you've seen that not only in the rhetoric from Congress, but also in our recognition that the open door policy of NATO is one of its key foundations, and our ability to bring in Montenegro and now Macedonia, I think, reflects the fact that we're willing to meet deeds with actions. I do think that there needs to be a reevaluation of the kinds of projects that NATO undertakes. And I think this is an opportunity for us to take this sort of renaissance of public commitment to NATO that is happening in Congress today as an opportunity for us to talk about whether we have the capacities in the United States and the things that we fund through the State Department and the Department of Defense to actually meet the real challenges that NATO is facing. I would argue that we are badly misresourced today when it comes to the real challenges that NATO countries present, and that our measure of contributions to NATO in military hardware dollars alone is not sufficient. So I would hope that this moment where we have two parties linking arms, committed to NATO, is also a moment for us to step up and think about some new capabilities that we can lend our Central European partners to try to face down the threats that they're facing.
Can you talk a little bit more about those capabilities? Are you talking about military capabilities? Are you talking about capabilities that are defined by commitment to shared values like democracy, rule of law, and such?
So I'm a big supporter of the European Reassurance Initiative. I think it's right that we invest that kind of money in a strategic defense relationship. But I also think it's blind to the fact that many of the challenges that Russia in particular presents to Central European allies fall outside of the purely military sphere. Senator Portman and I stood up a new capacity at the State Department called the Global Engagement Center, which we hope will seek to partner with countries in Central Europe to beef up objective journalism, to counter propaganda. Senator Johnson and I have a piece of legislation that we hope we can pass that would stand up a new $1 billion U.S. investment in energy independence, instead of just sort of giving advice to Central Europe on how they become energy independent of Russia. Why not actually put money on the table? Query whether, if we're going to go from $4 billion to $5 billion in the European Reinsurance Initiative, is that extra $1 billion better spent on purely military investment, or would $1 billion be better spent on actually building energy independence projects for the region? Those are the new capabilities that we talk a lot about, but we aren't always willing to invest in, that I think it's about time we do.
It's interesting you mentioned energy investment. I think the bill you've been pushing is very important because, as you may know, the region is driving forward the 3 Cs initiative, which is an effort to accelerate the development of cross-border infrastructure in energy, but also transport and telecom. Could you see the resources you want to allocate supporting 3 Cs initiative?
I just think we have to broaden what we view as national security investments, right? Russia sees the underwriting of its energy export as a national security investment. Nord Stream 2 makes no sense as a financial project. It is a national security project. The way in which Chinese technology is so much cheaper than everybody else's is because China views it as a national security investment to underwrite and subsidize the export of their technology. The United States traditionally looks at national security purely through the prism of investments in military hardware. Why not? Think about a major investment in energy independence for our partners in Central Europe as an extension of our national security spending. Why not look at a new investment in technology and trying to have competitors to Chinese 5G exports as an investment in national security? So I just think we've got to broaden that envelope. And if we do, I think we'll be able to offer a suite of tools for our partners in the region that right now they get in a subsidized fashion, but not from the United States.
You mentioned enlargement as one of the successes. But is enlargement, in your view, in NATO or in Europe, is that a finished process or should it continue? How do you feel about the transatlantic aspirations of Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance? Should the alliance respond positively to those aspirations? Are we doing enough to provide them a path to membership today?
So the open door has to be an open door, and that ultimately means that countries that want to join the security alliance, as long as they pass the tests for membership, are given that invitation. Chancellor Merkel would tell us often that had Ukraine and Georgia been in the alliance, that we'd be at war with Russia in those two countries. Many of us look at it very differently. Had we extended the alliance, perhaps those countries would be enjoying control of their territory and a degree of sovereignty that they don't today. And so I don't deny that Ukraine has a long way to go go until they are ready to join the alliance. But I think that the open door policy should remain an open door policy.
Is the region a zone of great power competition? You'd mentioned Russian pressure. You raised China as a new and very active, perhaps pernicious force in the Central European economy.
Well, I mean, this can't be a zero-sum game for Central Europe, and the United States shouldn't set it up as a zero-sum game. And I worry that when we talk in these terms of great power competition, we're suggesting that countries in Central Europe or countries in the Balkans have to make a choice. Of course, that can't be the case, and so we have to be competitive. We have to give economic and security options to those nations, but ultimately we need to build, I think, a relationship with Central Europe in which they are going to get certain things from the United States and from our alliance partners, but they are going to continue to have an important relationship, particularly an economic relationship looking east. I worry that the way in which we talk about great power competition suggests a false choice for countries in the region.
Let me throw one last question to you. Following on Dan's call or definition of overarching tasks that should define the U.S. relationship with our allies and partners in Central Europe, when you look forward to the next year, the next decade, say the next 100 years, what are the overarching tasks? What are the objectives that should drive our relationship with the region?
So I think understanding the challenges to democracy that are similar on both sides of the Atlantic and making communal investments in ways to fight those attacks. Again, I just don't assume that American democracy is going to be around for another 240 years. And so building those prophylactics together, I think, is important. I would argue this energy partnership is something that should guide us for the next 50 to 100 years. It's going to be the great question of the coming generations, how they keep the lights on, and who provides the resources to do that. And the United States can be much more integrated with Central Europe on that question as well. And then building upon our economic partnerships and doing that with presence. I thought Dan's last challenge was maybe the most important, making sure that the United States, both from a public and private sector standpoint, are present in Central Europe in a way that we have not been for the last decade to two, as we've taken for granted this relationship. So I think that public sector and private sector presence and using our public sector positions in the United States to push our American private sector components to be there, I think is an important part of the next chapter of our relationship.
Senator Murphy, thank you for your insights, and above all, thank you for your commitment to the U.S. relationship with Central Europe.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.